Thank you for listening to Bangtail, an action-adventure Western short story. Don't forget to hit subscribe above, so you can get a brand new Wild West audio thriller each week. Chapter 1. The entire trip from Texas to Montana, Rip Campbell had felt nervous and wary. He had never been gladder to see the rudiments of civilization than at this moment. His tired horse was warm enough, as the town loomed up in a fold of the broken hills 3 or 4 miles ahead, but Rip was pretty well frozen, and he had gone through the nerve-shattering experience of having been shot at from ambush and driven off the road an hour and a half ago. Doubly nerve-shattering, because it was only 3 days since he could mount a horse, after being holed up in a cave an equal length of time from a more accurate dry gulcher's bullet. That one had left a furrow across the top of his skull, which still made him lightheaded if he stooped over or whirled around suddenly. If he had been a half-inch taller, or if his horse had not had the sense to run or keep running while he hung on like a man asleep, he would be dead now. The town, Vane City he reckoned, dropped from sight as his horse slid down a rough bank and picked his way along the foot of an overhanging red bluff. The concealment was welcome. Yet his attacker might have circled and be lying in wait ahead of him. He rode with pistol in a numb-gloved hand, ears keened. The horse half shied, ears forward, and Rip threw a swift look toward the boulder ahead and at the brow of the bluff 40 feet above him as he cocked the pistol. And then, in the scattering of rocks before him, he saw bones. Human bones, still so fresh that he himself could catch a faint odor from them, though they had been picked clean by the buzzards and crows that had strung them along the rocks for 30 or 40 feet. He edged the horse forward, surprised that there wasn't a boot or belt or scrap of clothing anywhere around, but not greatly surprised to see the 3 bullet holes in one of the shoulder blades. It was lying inward side up, and the holes were splintery. The bullets had taken the man in the back. With a sudden crawling of his own back muscles, Rip threw a quick look behind and another above, but there was neither sound nor movement. He urged the horse on past the bones, the shod hoofs making a clatter that could be heard over hell's half-acre. It was good to be out of the freezing wind, but he still was glad when he came to sparsely grassed earth, even though it took him into the wind again, for the hoofbeats were quieter now. He urged the horse forward within the limits of mercy, and a few shaggy red cattle with lazy zebrans looked up from their browsing around an old haystack in a little swag. He was somber and depressed. This was a bad omen for a man coming to a new country. Shot at twice, and then finding the bones of a man. He was not superstitious, but still. Topping a rise, he presently got another glimpse of the town. A bellyful of hot grub and coffee, and 12 hours sleep. And in the morning, he would have to go back along the road to where he had ditched his bedroll, which contained his 30 years' gathering. Maybe there was a lawman here who would like to go out to where he was shot and also have a look at those bones. It wouldn't be much fun living around here with a back shooter running loose, and the sheriff or marshal might have some ideas on the matter. By this time tomorrow, he should be at the Bartee Ranch, and when he got there, he aimed first off to give a good cussing to Shorty Graves and Cash Emmett, his foreman and top hand. He had sent them up here 3 months ago to handle things while he was settling affairs in Texas. They had sworn to high heaven they would write him. Of course, he might have failed to connect with their letters on the road, but he privately imagined they just hadn't got around to it. Rip came out of the broken country onto the road now, and presently he crossed a frost-rimmed creek bed and rode into the town. The rutted street had a crust of frozen mud which creaked and sagged with the horse. Smoke from several flues scudded down upon them as Rip headed for what appeared to be a dilapidated livery barn. Yes, it was a livery all right. A sheeted buckboard, tongue propped up, was before it, and horse tracks disappeared at the closed door. "Hello, the livery," Rip yelled through stiff stubble-brushed lips. Fog was wiped simultaneously from 3 spots on the grimy windows of the hotel next door, and men peered out. One of them disappeared, and a moment later the door opened and a man came out getting into a coat, grotesque with a dirty apron flapping about his legs. He cocked a quizzical black eye at Rip and said, "Howdy, mister." "Howdy. Wanting livery room, huh?" Rip got stiffly down, swallowing the reply he would have liked to make to such time-passing talk. Jerking and dragging at the sagging door, the man said, "This old froze mud. It's a caution to snakes how hard 'tis to get into the barn on account of it." He gave Rip another look. "Come far, mister?" Rip was light-headed, and he stood a moment, steadying himself. "Pretty far," he said. "That's so. Well, ain't no fun riding a day like this. I'd rather be holed up by a good stove, but seems like I just get settled down, and here comes somebody wanting in the livery, or wanting to be showed to a room, or wanting an order of ham and eggs, or whatever. My woman, she's been down sick for 3-4 years, and that leaves a heap for me to do." Rip hardly saw how the man could be so pestered by business. The town was about ghosted out. Practically all its 12.5 buildings appeared to be empty. 4 or 5 horses stood at a hitch rack down the street. The 2 men in the hotel peered at him through the window. There was no other sign of life. The liveryman gave another heave at the door that got it over the frozen hump of mud, and Rip led the horse in. "There's the hay, and here's the oat bin. I got to get back to see, has they anything bumming on the stove. Wish you'd shut the door as you come out," the man said as he departed. 2 other horses were in the creaking gloom of the barn. No, they were mules. Evidently, they belonged with the buckboard. And now, he saw a third animal. A horse breathing rather hard, and its back dark with sweat where a saddle had been. Rip stripped his horse and tended him. The liveryman had run his mouth so hard and fast that it was only now that he recollected he had forgotten to ask him if he knew anything about Shorty Graves and Cash Emmett. You couldn't exactly say that Rip had inherited the bar tea. In the old days, his father had sent his Aunt Doris thousands of dollars, which enabled her to keep the ranch going while fighting Indians and renegades after her husband was killed. Lately, now that all such trouble was behind, she had made quite a good thing of it. The army remount got first pick of her horses, and sometimes she supplied them with upwards of 100 head a year, not counting draft stock and mules. And now, along with the land and stock and equipment, the army contracts had come to Rip, partly as an inheritance, partly as bread returned from the waters. And there seemed something of the working of Providence in the matter, for he had just seen himself set back near to ruination in the cattle business in Texas by hoof and mouth disease. "Mr. Campbell." Rip turned at the sound of a woman's voice. He saw her against the light of the doorway, peering back here. She had bundles in her arms. "Sorry," she said. "Wrong party." "Oh, excuse me." "I beg your pardon, lady, but could you tell me who's in town that owns a sorrel horse, white star, white stocking on left fore and right rear foot?" And he sized it up, 15 hands high. "Really, I'm afraid I couldn't," she answered stiffly. Rip ignored her manner. "Somebody that's just rode in." "Why," she said, "it could be Sarah Innes." "Thanks." He didn't reckon Sarah Innes had been shooting at him, whoever she was. As he came out of the livery with rifle, empty grub sack and saddlebags, the woman was putting her things into the buckboard. Rip gave a shove at the door, and got enough momentum to send it halfway shut. Another wrench, which threatened to snap off the hinges, sent it the rest of the way. He saw that the woman was eyeing him covertly as she stowed the things in the wagon. He reckoned she didn't see a lot. 5'10" of plainsman pushing 30, heavy-boned, black hair shaggy, face stubbled. The trip up here had been a mean one, but it should be obvious to her, he thought, that his clothes had once been expensive and well-made. That he wasn't a bum. Probably, he thought wryly, she would take him for an outlaw, and one a long way from home if she recognized his Texas twang. An odd brand was burned into the side of the wagon, a pair of horns with an irregularly shaped figure between, like maybe a cowhide. That the hide and horns brand, lady? I've heard about it. Apparently, she was going to enter into no further conversation with a stranger, and a little on his dignity, he said. Well, I apologize. But after all, you spoke to me first. She colored. She looked to be maybe 20 years old, say in 2 years of that either way, and her gray eyes and the set of her mouth looked like she had quite a bit of sand. All right. It's the hide and horns, she admitted. Not very easy to change, I reckon, Rip observed. He could have added that his aunt had found the hide and horns owners as hard to change as brand blotters found their mark to be. He added, I guess that would make you one of the Haleys, wouldn't it? She said. Honestly, I haven't the faintest desire to stand here, freezing to death just talking to you. If you don't go away, I shall have to be rude to you. Rip had forgotten to be on his dignity. Raising one brow at her, he drawled. The hell-roaring Haleys. Well, my apologies, lady. I'll try to get a formal introduction later, he went on, as she flushed again. But right now, I'm your new neighbor. Rip Campbell. She could drawl, too. Oh, I'm so happy to know you. I'm the Queen of Sheba. She turned to put the rest of her things away. Rip stood there a moment somewhat taken aback, and then with a shrug he headed for the hotel. What was she expecting him to look like? Well, she would feel silly enough when she learned for a fact that he was Rip Campbell. The two men quickly turned away from their foggy peepholes as he came even with the window, and as he went into the hotel, they stood silently smoking at the side of the room. The man in the dirty apron punched up a fire in the stove. The heat felt mighty good to Rip. He could stand a lot of thawing out. He put his plunder on a chair and peeled off his woolen gloves. A lunch counter and a couple of rickety tables were at the far end of the room. The kitchen was visible through a door beyond, and there was a smell of coffee and onions and ancient grease. The host banged down the lid of the stove, and as it roared afresh, one of the other men cleared his throat ponderously and said, What's the news, friend? Heard anything on old Brigham? He aiming to give up, or not? He peered at Rip from small, pale eyes for a moment, and then studied his cigar as he raked the ashes off onto the floor with a little finger which had a couple of rings with red sets. Rip's glance moved from him to the other man to the host. They were eyeing him expectantly, but their looks went swiftly elsewhere as he observed them. Was the man just making conversation, or did he really want to know the news? Or, Rip asked himself, were these folks trying to find out if he came up from the southward, maybe, up through Utah? He said, I was just fixing to ask you the same thing. Yeah. The man's expression didn't change. That's so. Rip's face was beginning to thaw, and his cheeks and the sides of his nose burned where wind had chapped him, and his fingers itched. He looked again at the host. Coffee. Yes, sir. Sure, got it. Hot and strong and plentiful. If I do say it myself, I make good coffee. Don't I, Mr. Fulton? Don't I, Mr. Bragg? The two men agreed that he did. Just give me a cup of it, Rip said. I'm about frozen out. The door opened, and the girl from the buckboard said, Mr. Holden, could I have your assistance? Soon as I get this gentleman a cup of coffee and my coat on. Come in and warm. She said. Thank you, I just have to get cold all over again. She closed the door, shutting herself out. Them was her mules in the livery, Holden explained. I'll take that coffee black, no sugar or cream, Rip said. Holden took the hint and went to the kitchen and came back with a heavy mug in one hand and a gray granite coffee pot in the other. She's boiled down thick as six in a bed, he said, filling the cup at the counter. You mean to take a room here? Thought of it, Rip admitted. All right then. I'll just set the pot handy. You'll have to eat here too, on account of they ain't anywhere else to eat, less you just buy some junk at the store. And the way I figure it, if a customer fills up on coffee, he won't be so liable to eat a lot of grub. I'm coming, he shouted as the girl tapped on the window, though Rip doubted if she could hear above the howling of the wind out there. Holden lugged in sour-smelling cornbread, and a bowl of cold beans and a plate and a spoon. Don't reckon you forgot to shut that barn door, did you, mister? He struggled into his coat. Rip wiped the grease off the spoon onto his neck scarf and said, I shut it. Cuss it. Holden growled querulously. Wish you hadn't. Now I got to open it all over again. He went out, still complaining to himself. The coffee was about as bad as Rip had ever sampled, but it was hot. He had his scarf and outer coat off, and was on his second cup and his second plate of beans when Holden came in again. While the door was still open, Rip saw the buckboard pulling out to the northwest, the opposite direction from which he had come into town. The hide and horns lay to the upper side of the road. As Rip remembered the roughly drawn map his aunt had sent of the country years ago when his father talked of coming up here for a look-see. The Bar T buildings were also on the upper side and beyond the H&H, but Bar T Range sprawled over to the south side of the road too, and came jutting this way toward Vane City for 8 or 10 miles to join the Lazy Z. And it was Lazy Z cattle Rip had seen around that old haystack near where he found the bones today. The Z was just a little one-gallus outfit, tolerated by the H&H because the latter now handled only sheep, and liked to have a place to get a little beef now and then, and tolerated by the Bar T because the old man who owned it was a friend of his Aunt Doris's during her lifetime. Rip finished and rose. The two men abruptly went outside with a soft jangling of rowels on the splintered floor, and Holden said conversationally, Come far, mister? You asked me that once, Rip told him casually. His fingers and toes were beginning to burn as circulation picked up in them. Did I sign a register here? Rip said. I got one, if you're just itching to sign it. Some do and some don't. I'll see can I find it. Well, skip it. I'll go to my room now, Rip said. You don't reckon you remember a couple of men who came through here 3 months ago? Shorty Graves and Cash Emmett. He was going to describe them, but Holden interrupted him. Graves? Why, now, there's a nester over on Little Rattlesnake name of Gravesend. Got 9 kids. Don't reckon you mean him. Right up these stairs. I'll give you number 12, up over this room. Got a smoke drum up there from this stove that warms it up mighty nice. Gathering up his gun and saddlebags, Rip said. These are just a couple of punchers. Texas Saddles, J.C. Brandt. Coming up here to work for the Bar T, but they mayn't have come through this town, and of course, I guess the Bar Ts do their Saturday night at Saddle Up. Why, not always, Holden said. Mr. Campbell, he buys lots of supplies here because they're freighted in from this direction, and that makes it cheaper. Mr. Campbell? Rip asked. Rip Campbell, that owns the Bar T, mighty nice feller. Mighty nice. He goes with that gal that was in here, Martha Haley, her name is. He inherited the Bar T from his Aunt Doris. Doris Lackley Campbell, her full name was. And by gum, she always put the whole handle down on my register when she took a night here, meeting horse buyers. Raised horses, she did. Mostly, that is. Few cattle for the table. What time she wasn't quarreling with old Hide and Horns Haley, I mean. I think that's what killed her. He died, and she never had nobody to quarrel with. Weren't no fun quarreling with Haley's daughter, I reckon. Just dwindled away, and died like an old cow that's off her feed for no special reason. Rip stood there, still staring at the man, hardly hearing his words. So Rip Campbell was here. He had inherited the property. Something was beginning to clear up in Rip's mind. Whoever was up here pretending to be him, someone who knew of his aunt's death and of the disposition of her property, probably had had men watching the trails from Texas to here, hanging around hotels watching the registers, keeping their eyes and ears open for the real Rip Campbell of Texas. Men who would shoot to kill, and who, Rip was certain now, had shot at him with that intent twice in the past week. Holden cleared his throat and repeated, "Right up these stairs, mister." Rip decided not to call attention to himself by inquiring about a law officer here or about any missing person. Not until he knew the lay of the land a little better. Then he remembered he had told that girl who he was. And now Holden said she was this Rip Campbell's girl. Sure aiming to turn cold, Holden gabbled on. "Ah, what did you say your name was?" Because of the wind, Rip had heard no sound of anyone's approaching the hotel, but now, before he could answer, the door was shoved open. Rip whirled, jumpier inside than he would have admitted. Beyond the man who was half-turned to shut the door after himself, Rip could see the white horse he had noticed at the hitch rack down the street. Then the man turned this way. It was Shorty Graves. Shorty's glance went idly past Rip. He said, "Mr. Holden, I wanted to ask you about them darn flapjacks. No matter what I do to them, they're tough. And Mr. Campbell, he raises hell." "That's so," Holden said. And to Rip, "This here is the cook out to the bar tea. Well, now Knowlesby, flapjacks is funny things. If you just had eggs, would be a heap simpler." Knowlesby. That was Shorty's middle name. "I ain't got no eggs," he said. He came forward to warm his hands. "Anyhow, I'll take a cup of coffee." Holden looked at Rip. "You mind if I get him a cup of coffee? Your room's just above this one. You can't miss it if you want to go on up." "Thanks," Rip said. Holden departed. Shorty whispered, "Where'd you meet Cash?" "Cash? He lit out 3 weeks ago to warn you the road south of here is being watched for you. He goes under the name of Cass Cashown." "I never saw him," Shorty said. "I don't see how you got through without him. This varmint who's dealt himself into the bar tea with your name is tough. I can tell from his talk he's been in Texas, and he may have seen you personally. Don't come out to the ranch without changing your face. He keeps 4-5 gun hands by his side all the time, or I'd have done shot him already. He's playing for keeps." Holden was returning with the coffee, and Rip steadied his voice and said, "Yep, I reckon maybe it could snow." But a fear had brought the sweat out on him. Maybe those bones he had found were Cash's. No. Cash had a gold tooth. He would certainly have noticed that. Shorty called, "How about fixing me up a mess of ham and eggs, real quick? Because I got to be going back with the boys in a minute soon as they get them pack mules loaded. I'm so darn tired of eating my own cooking, I got to have a change." Holden went back to the kitchen. Shorty whispered, "Only way I could get on out there was as cook. I had a hurt back and couldn't ride fit for nothing. Little fight me and Cash got in with some tin horns as we come through Fulton's Fist down in Idaho. Got our horses stole there. This bar T Maverick, he put Cash in the line camp on the top of Red Rock to keep the hides and horns sheep herders from mooching over onto him. Cash herding sheep herders, and me herding the pots and pans. Anyhow, Cash took out to warn you." Holden came back in. "Got the ham sizzling," he said. "Done had it sliced. You want to come back to the kitchen? I'll show you about them flapjacks whilst your ham fries, Mr. Knowlesby. I always mix my breakfast ones up about this time of day anyhow. They got to work overnight." Rip saw there was no point in lingering here in the room unless he could get rid of Holden. About the most he could hope to accomplish by trying to carry on any further talk with Shorty would be to rouse Holden's suspicions, or at best his curiosity. Shorty exclaimed, "Oh shucks. Cliff is waving at me from the store window over there. You eat that ham, Mr. Holden." He gulped the coffee, tossed a $50 on the counter, and would have left without his change, but Holden said, "Ham ain't hurt. I'll just fix it for the next feller. By the way, Sarah Innes never mentioned it, Mr. Knowlesby, but what about you going by and taking a message to old Zeke?" "Oh sure, Shorty said, if you think it'd help." "Well, just tell him that Sarah's a good girl. That she'd love to come home, and that if he'd just lift a finger to tell her he was sorry, she'd be right there." Shorty said, "Well, I'll get a bawling out for my pains, but I'm willing. Not that she ain't welcome to stay here, long as she wants to," Holden added quickly. "She's company for my woman. Sweeps and makes beds and does some of the cooking." Shorty said, "Well, I got to go." He escaped, and Holden said, "Sad case. Sad case. Old Zeke Innes, he's proud as go to hell. Might near it blind. Cross as a grizzly in April. Poor as Job's church mouse, or is it Job's turkey? That there is a funny saying, I always thought." He shook his head. Sad case, sad case. All the girl was trying to do was just raise a little money. Here, write this away. Rip was too weary and still too cold to ask any polite questions about a matter in which he hadn't the vaguest interest. He followed Holden upstairs. The man held his apron up to keep from tripping on it, and showed Rip into number 12, and departed. Rip put his stuff on the bed, and peeled off his gun belt, and hung it on the rickety iron post. Downstairs, Holden whistled, and hummed snatches of Camptown races, and the sound was unusually loud. Surprised at the tone of it, Rip looked about him, and then he had it. The stovepipe picked it up and brought it up to the smoke drum, a tin contraption the size of a barrel, from which another pipe went through a square of tin in the ceiling. The room wasn't as warm as the hall had been from the heat which came up the stairway. Rip opened the door again, and as he peeled out a little further, having in mind to shave, he went over to the window to see if he could get a line on the men Shorty was with. They had evidently loaded the mules behind the store at a warehouse room, for he saw 15 or 20 animals strung on ropes and a couple of other riders leading them. And then he saw something else. The two men who had been downstairs here in the hotel were standing across the street looking at a wanted poster. The larger one was gabbling at the other, and once he chucked a thumb over his shoulder toward the hotel. Abruptly, Rip stepped to the bed and opened a saddlebag and got out his brass telescope. At the window, he started to focus it at the poster, but on second thought he swung it toward the riders with Shorty while he still could. It was a good glass. He had traded 4 prime steers for it in Dodge, and it brought the men's faces up until he could see the blackheads on the nose of the red-bearded one, and a swollen sty with a dead hair in the center on the right eye of the swart one. The swart one's face suddenly contorted, and he flung words over his shoulder at the mules he was leading. They turned into the main street now so that Rip could no longer see their faces, and he switched the glass to the men across the street, and ran the eyepiece down to where it brought their heads leaping at him, with the poster showing between. It bore not the usual, conventional, smeary face made by a woodcut, but one that looked remarkably like Rip himself. Underneath were the words, $2,500 dead or alive. And under that, the state of California will pay the above sum for one tug roll, aged about 25 to 30, 5 feet 10 inches, solid build, WT, 170, dark hair and eyes, slight limp in right leg, scar on right cheek about 2 inches long. Alias James Call, alias James Rip, alias John Cartner. This man is dangerous, will kill without warning if cornered or suspects he is about to be. Would be best to take him without warning if certain he is found. Rip's life processes stopped for a moment. That was a perfect description of himself. He never read these wanted signs. He didn't doubt but that he had passed many just like this between here and Texas, cleverly put up by this impostor who had dreamed up this imaginary reward in order to get Rip killed. Maybe those who had shot at him had never even seen this man who had taken over the bar T. Maybe they were simply after that money. Behind Rip, a feminine voice drawled, "Put your hands up and don't turn around." He raised his hands, his pulse picking up. And then the voice said, "All right, turn now." Chapter 2. He turned, careful to keep his hands high just so there was no mistake in his intent. He saw that she had the gun belt he had hung on the bedpost. Her dark eyes were level and determined, her mouth set. She wore whipcord riding trousers and a buckskin vest. Rip said, "Hello." What name had that Miss Haley called the girl who had owned the winded horse? Sarah. Sarah Innes. And Holden had talked of her too, her and her daddy, old Zeke. "Hello, Sarah." Her face had paled with nervousness, but not so much that the coldness of riding in the wind didn't leave her cheekbones with color. Now she flushed, eyeing him sharply. "Cousin Sarah, maybe I should say," he added, "until we're better acquainted. How's Uncle Zeke?" Her eyes were uncertain, but the gun didn't waver. She said, "Who are you?" He wished now he had let Holden bore him with details concerning Zeke and Sarah. He said, "Well, now that I see you, I guess I'm a pretty lucky hombre. Great snakes. I never thought you'd look like this." He cocked his head. "Who did you think I was when you threw that gun on?" Why? Rip said. "Uncle Zeke's letter was kind of, balled up. Didn't make right good sense. I thought I better have a look. He thinks that you've turned against him, that you don't love him." The girl said, "Oh, he's wrong. He's wrong. We needed money. The bar T ruined us. The new owner, a Mr. Rip. Well, I gathered that, about the money I mean, though he didn't say so in the letter. So you were going to catch yourself an outlaw and get the reward. How'd you plan to get me to California?" And when she made no answer, he asked, "How much do you need?" No, it's sort of an investment. It's been drawing interest many a long year. Don't you reckon Uncle Zeke ever did anyone a favor?" She said, "If I thought you were just making that up, to make it easy for me to take help." Her voice was unsteady. "And another thing, my daddy can't write. He never had any schooling, and he can't read even printing. How'd he write you a letter?" Rip said, "Maybe he had somebody write for him." She shook her head. "You're lying to me. I don't know just how, but you are. I can feel it." Rip started to deny that, and then he said, "All right. Abruptly, something occurred to him. Maybe that smoke drum carried sound down as well as up. He lowered his voice. "Open that saddlebag with the conchas. You'll find letters and papers." She got his rifle from the bed. "You do it," she ordered, backing off. "And no tricks." She cocked the pistol, and when he had found the bundle he sought and opened it, she said, "Put them on the bed and face the wall." He heard the rustling of the letters and documents and a murmured sound or two. And finally she said, "What is this? Some of those aliases on that wanted poster are a lot like his name. Are you a black sheep brother of his or something? Or are you just somebody who held him up on his way up here and took these papers?" He said, "Sit down and take it easy and let me talk. Doris Rip was my aunt, my daddy's brother's wife. You? Oh, a new story. First you are my long-lost cousin. Now you are Miss Doris's nephew." Rip said, "Look at it this way for a moment. Either I do have a right to those letters, and the bar T is mine, and this fellow who has taken it over is a fake, or else I'm a fake. Right. Of course. Very well. Does he act like a fake? Does he act like he's scared of something? Why, he does keep guards out. And he's armed his men, though there's been no trouble around here for years. And he's had me shot at twice in 6 days. That brought him up with a jolt. Or were you the one who threw that dry gulch bullet at me today? She went back a step, until the foot of the bed stopped her. No. And indignantly. Do I look like a dry gulcher? You'd been riding somewhere mighty hard. I saw your horse. Looking for a friend, she said. But I guess you wouldn't understand that. The words lashed Rip, and he demanded. What right have you to guess that? You've lied to me, tried to play on an imaginary kinship, anything to save your hide. Well, go on and save it. Get out of my sight. Get out of this town, and keep going. I don't want any blood money, after all. You call yourself a man. If my friend should come riding up now, you could see what a man looks and acts like. Maybe you'll run into him, as you drift. His name is Cass Cashown. Cass Cashown. That was the name Shorty had said the vanished Cash Emmett was going by here. Rip decided to take a chance. If she and Cash were really friends, she'd know his real name. Yet, they apparently hadn't been friendly enough that Cash had told her what the real layout here was. Still, he said, his name, as you call it, is not Cass Cashown, but Cash Emmett. Her eyes showed nothing but indignation. Rip said, fellow about my height. Missouri cottonmouth drawl, with a Texas influence. Tattooed, a lady on his right arm, though I expect he kept his sleeve down around you. Upper gold tooth in front. Ring on his right hand with a gold saddle on it, and the stirrups hung over the horn. Had a fight at Fulton's Fist a few days before he got here, and may have been skinned up some, but I don't know. I haven't seen him. At last, he saw he was hitting deep water. He had at least described someone she knew. She said, how did you know he had a fight if you hadn't seen him? Saw his partner, the man he left my ranch in Texas with. Fellow who got on at the bar Tia's cookie, and whose life won't be worth a tin horn's promise if they tumble to who he is. Sarah Innes let down the hammer of her pistol and put it into the holster she wore. She said, all right. You've told me so many things I don't know which, if any, to believe. Rip had one more card to play, and he flipped it out. I'll make one last try on Cash's account. Or Cass's, if you want to call him that. My daddy sent a picture of himself to Aunt Doris several years ago. A picture to hang on the wall, a big one. You must have seen it. Look me over. Do I look anything like it? That is, if I had a heavy gray mustache, would I? Why, I believe so. Around your forehead. And this other fellow. Abruptly she sagged upon a stool, and rubbed the heels of her trembling hands in her eyes. She said, I'm almost out of my mind. I don't know who looks like who. First I'm at outs with my father. And now I'm afraid something's happened to Cass. I thought Martha Haley's sheepherders had shot him. But if all this is true you're telling me, maybe this Barty fellow has found out who he really is and done away with him. But he came to meet me. She shook her head. He wouldn't have gone without seeing me. The vanity of women. Rip said, well, maybe something came up that he couldn't see you. He can take care of himself. But suddenly, deep in his heart, a small serpent of doubt began uncoiling. At the moment, he had a crusted bullet furrow across the top of his head to show that he couldn't take care of himself, and he didn't figure Cash was any better man than he was. And some other poor devil, who probably thought he could take care of himself, had come to a harsh and terrible end out there in that canyon a few miles from here. There came a tapping in the smoke room. The rattle of the stove lid below, and a hollow voice that was recognizable as the hotel keeper said, "Better put a dally on that. Company's coming." Rip said, "Damn," mentally. He guessed Holden could be trusted, but he didn't know. He stepped to the window and peered down through the ancient lace curtain which choked him with dust as his nose touched it. The two men who had been looking at the wanted poster were crossing the street this way. He said, "Here quick, Miss Sarah." She came to his side. "Those hombres, they in with this guy who calls himself Rip, claim to be mining men. I don't know. They hang around here some and ride into the hills some. They don't seem to do much." Before they reached the door of the hotel, they turned in their tracks, looking toward the direction from which Rip had ridden into town. By putting his eye close to the right-hand side of the window, Rip could see a rider coming beyond the creek bed. Not fast, not slow. The breath whipped back whitely from man and beast. But it was not Cash Emmett. The man rode on up as the two stood there. A lean, rangy man with weathered flesh above his sandy head, Rip saw as the brim of his old hat was turned up by the wind. He got down where the two men stood. The three were speaking at the same time. The newcomer made short, sharp gestures with his free hand. "His name's Berger," Sarah said. "He rides for Campbell, that is, for the bar tea." "New hand?" "Sure. All of Miss Doris's hands are gone. Campbell cut wages by half, and all the old hands quit, and then of course he raised them back up again for the hands he hired on." Berger took his horse into the livery, and as the two men followed, Rip said, "That's odd. I didn't see any horse in that barn for them. None but yours and Miss Haley's mules. They use a barn behind one of those deserted buildings. Buy their feed over at a store." The three men came out of the livery and into the hotel. And now a voice came up the stairway and rumbled in the smoke drum. "Coffee, Holden, and grub. I'm nigh froze out. I tell you I'm right, Berger. There's no argument about it." "That's Fulton," Sarah whispered. "Who's arguing?" Berger cried. "I tell you, I won't be pushed around." Fulton said, "If I thought you was double-crossing me." Holden cried, "Look out." There came a crash of gunfire. Several shots which blended into one roar that trembled the floor. Then silence. And finally Fulton wheezed. "Well, he asked for it. He drew on me. You all saw him draw." A woman called out feebly, "That would be Mrs. Holden." Holden said, "Get the hell out. Get him out of here, and stay away from my place." Fulton said, "No use getting heat up. What did you want me to do? Stand there and let him kill me?" Sarah said, "I'll go see Mrs. Holden." "Get out," Holden repeated. "Take him with you. I know my rights." As Sarah left the room, Rip looked out the window to see the two men come out of the door below, carrying the body grotesquely by armpits and heels. The face was bloody. They crossed the street to the store and went in. Thoughtfully, Rip locked the door of his room and put a chair under the knob, then balanced the empty tin pitcher and washpan on the chair. He took off his boots, put his weapons handy, and crawled into bed in his clothes. Chapter 3. A knock awakened him. He lay there for what seemed to him to be hours, with it penetrating his sleep. He knew it sounded like a knock. Yet he thought he might just be dreaming it was one, and that if he kept his eyes closed, the dream would change to something else. "Hello in there." He opened his eyes. It was either twilight or dawn. He couldn't tell from his rocky, beaten-out feeling whether he had slept 3 hours or 15. "Hello in there." Sarah Innes's voice. "Yeah. I mean, yes, ma'am? Anything wrong?" "It's 8 o'clock. We were just wondering if you were all right." 8. He looked toward the window. It was a raw, gray day outside. Dark as it ought to be at 6:30. "Thanks," he said. He got up and worked his boots on and ran a dry hand over his stubble. Shivering, he took a look at himself in the mirror. He really looked hard. A gust of wind struck him, and now he saw that a pane of the window was broken out, glass scattered inside the room. And against the wall by the door was a rock with a paper tied around it. He picked it up and worked the string off and unfolded the paper. He had to take it to the window to read it. It was in pencil, printed in rough letters. "Pretend to ride out today for your bedroll, but go to where you found the bones yesterday. We'll have roll there for you. A friend." This was the thing he must figure out for himself, so he did not mention the note to Sarah. He explained the broken window by saying that someone had thrown a rock through it while he slept. All she said was, "Well, that's odd." A circuit preacher had ridden in during the night. He was occupied in converting the heathen, both white and red, he remarked facetiously as he ate breakfast with Rip. He seemed to be well known to Sarah. She served them steak, biscuits, gravy, and molasses, and for butter, you could have bacon grease to stir in the molasses if you wanted it. Rip found out from the talk what the trouble between Sarah and her father was. She had ridden in to saddle up on pay night at the mines, and between bucking a wheel and playing poker with several cattlemen and miners, had brought home $3,800 with which to renew the lease on their government range. When her father, old Zeke, found out the money was gambling money and that she had been in a deadfall, he went into a terrific rage and ordered her from the house. He had let his lease lapse, and the Bar T had taken it up and was threatening to run all of Zeke's Lazy Z cattle plumb to Canada if he wouldn't sell them to the Bar T. Old Zeke had countered by promising to shoot on sight any Bar T man who stirred dust on his range. Abruptly, judging from the widening of her dark eyes, the same thought seemed to strike Sarah Innes that struck Rip. Perhaps the man who shot at him yesterday was old Zeke. Maybe he had got trigger happy and was shooting at all strangers. Rip ate the last half of his meal without tasting it. After breakfast, he crossed the street to the store to get an extra suit of underwear, for it had turned colder in the night. Ancient lettering on the window said, "Jacob Pringle, Gentle MDSE. Harness, HDWE. Furs hide wool bought and sold. Mining property. Undertaking. Furniture." Maybe it had been engaged in all those activities once, but now it was just another cluttered range country store run by a wispy little man whose skin was the same dead grayness as his wild spray of hair. He was polishing a smutty lamp chimney, but he stopped to get Rip the long handles from a tumbled pile on the counter. All morning, Rip had been thinking of something. Maybe Martha Haley was this imposter's sweetheart, as Holden had said. But that wasn't necessarily against her, in this land where men who would feel free to court a wealthy woman were scarce. No doubt the fellow put up a smooth, convincing front. But something was wrong. Why by now hadn't the so-called Rip picked up the news from Martha that someone was in town claiming to be the owner of the Bar T? Obviously, he hadn't picked up that news, or he would have been here, snorting and prancing. Or would he? Maybe he would just stand pat where he was and be more watchful. It could be that the girl had had time to do some thinking and hadn't said anything to the man. A woman who could handle the affairs of the Hide and Horns outfit might have sense enough to have put two and two together by the time she got home. To remember, perhaps, some things about this interloper that didn't make sense. To the storekeeper, Rip said, "Reckon I better have a clean shirt too and a new neck scarf." If he went by to see Martha, he wanted to look a little better than yesterday. The merchant got the things. Evidently he had never looked at that wanted poster outside, because he showed no nervousness whatever at Rip's presence. Rip said, "Reckon I could change in that back room?" Cold in there, but suit yourself. And you'll have that dead man for company. He ain't been sent for. Reckon I can stand it if he can. Several coffins were standing on end back there, but one, the lid closed, lay on a couple of sawhorses. Rip was shivering as he got down to his cotton shirt and drawers, over which he was going to wear the woolen underwear. Just as he raised his foot to scoot it into a leg, above the creak of the building and the howl of the wind under the eaves, he heard a sudden flurry of hoofs. As he peered through the door crack to have a look out front, half a dozen or more men, muffled in heavy scarfs, tied their horses and stalked in with a jingling of cold spurs. The foremost one said, "Howdy, Pringle. That drifter you sent out last night said my man Burger got gunned to death." The storekeeper nodded apologetically. "Yes, sir, Mr. Rip, he did, I reckon. Best I got the story. Him and those two mining men, Fulton and Bragg, had an argument, and Burger drawed." Hot excitement beat through Rip there in the back room, and anger and apprehension struggled together in him as he tried to see the big fellow who was impersonating him. But the man had got out of his range of vision. His voice came through, rumbling and heavy. A voice Rip felt certain he had never heard. "The damn fool." He broke off, growling. "Here, open me a can of them peaches, Pringle. I'm hungry. That cook of ours would starve a man to death. What did Burger draw on two men at once for?" "I never heard," the merchant declared. The 6 men with the boss each ordered a can of peaches. The glimpses Rip could get of them showed them to be about as capable a looking set as he had ever seen. Capable of taking care of themselves. At least 3 had their holsters tied down. They wore short sheepskin jackets, no coattails in their way. Only one of them looked as if he might kill a man just for the fun of it, but the others gave the impression they could do the job if at all expedient. Evidently they were drawing shooting pay, for while their pants were sloppy, their boots were bench-made, their belts and holsters of the finest, and those hats had come from St. Louis at $70 or $80 each. Rip wished he was dressed. A man was in one hell of a fix without his pants on. He couldn't move about much or call attention to himself. "Did you put Burger up nice?" the boss asked. "Yes, sir. Nice as I could." "What's it aiming to cost me?" "Well, I'd rightly ought to have $50, Mr. Campbell." The man known as Campbell grunted. "All right." The dirty son had nearly that coming to him. "In the back room here. I'll have a look while you open them peaches. Boys, let's have a look at the damn fool who drew on 2 men. It'll give us something to think about. Here's an order of groceries, Pringle. You can send them out if those slow pokes ever get here with the wagon for Burger. And I don't want no more buggy beans." Rip knew they would shoot him like a dog back here. Hiding was beyond question, even if he wanted to hide. The only defense was to attack. He drew the pistol from the holster he had hung on the corner of a packing box there by the coffin, and as the men clumped and jingled this way, he opened the door wide and stepped into it, gun hammer drawn back under his thumb. Chapter 4. The men stopped in their tracks. The boss's big, lean face was a study of amazement. He said, "What the hell is wrong with you?" Over his shoulder, he cried, "Pringle, get this drunk out of the Arctic." "Mr. Campbell." What a laugh. And taking a cue from the wanted poster out front, he added, "That's not what you used to call yourself." The man warned, "Better put that gun down, you barefooted half-wit." One of the gunmen wet his lips with a quick dart of his tongue. He said, "Hey boss, look at that guy." "Huh." Slow recognition came into the boss's dark eyes. And as he cocked his big head on one side, Rip had the fleeting impression that he had seen the man before. Probably in a Texas saloon. Rip said, "You're pretty slick, fellow, but you're through. Raise your hands, all of you, and turn around." The big man shook his head, his jaws solid. "No. And if you shoot me and these boys don't kill you, which they will, you'll be hung higher than Haman. I'm unarmed. We've got law here." The moment stretched and became intolerable. Rip said, "Get a gun from one of your sharks." The man to the fellow's left, a short man with a drooping eyelid, said, "Boss, you can have mine." He casually started for his gun, as if to hand it to his master, and then his hand darted. As he tilted the holster to fire through the bottom, Rip flipped his thumb off his own hammer. The gunman's bullet slashed into the jam by his elbow, and deafened by the explosions. Rip cried, "Don't do it," through the black smoke as he dropped to a knee. But the man to his extreme right was drawing anyway. Rip fired again. The others backed watchfully toward the door, as the second man staggered in a sidling, overbalanced dancing step toward the first gunman who was on his hands and knees. He stumbled over him, and they went to the floor in a heap as Rip moved out of the smoke. He said, "Stop in your tracks." But 3 of the men had their hands on their guns now. One said, "You better let us get out of here, cowboy. You can't get us all. I want your boss who calls himself Campbell. Campbell. You dirty." It was only then that he saw a woman through the glass of the door, just behind the fellow. She opened it. It was Sarah Innes. The boss gave one wild glance behind him, and probably decided Rip wouldn't shoot for fear of hitting Sarah. He backed to the door, his men closing about him. He drawled, "Adios, amigo. Next time, it will be different. Ah, Miss Innes. A lovely winter day." Rip fleetingly wished he had his pants. Yet, if Sarah Innes had never seen a man in his underwear, she wouldn't know what he was, and if she had, it wouldn't make any difference. The men got past her, even as Rip yelled for her to get out of the way. As they untied their bridles, Rip fired through the front window, and as the cold glass shattered, a man who had stepped in front of the impostor jerked and stumbled. The boss ducked behind his horse as Rip fired again, and then the men were on their horses and riding hard. Rip ran to the door and threw the remaining shot in the pistol after them, but if he made a hit, he didn't know it. One of the men whirled, and Rip stepped back into the store before the sound of the fellow's gun rattled along the street. "Got a rifle in here?" he cried. The merchant said, "I'm not in this fight. You got no right coming here like this in." Rip ran to the horses in front, which belonged to the fallen men in the store. He drew a Winchester from the boot of the saddle on one of the shying animals. He fired at once and missed before he saw that the sight was set for extreme range. And then the men broke apart into dips at the sides of the road beyond the town. He could still hear them running. He took a splinter an inch long from his right foot, and the place pained him as he saddled up 10 minutes later in the livery. Sarah came running back from the hotel with his horse's bridle, which she had taken in to warm, so that the bits wouldn't peel the skin off the animal's tongue and mouth. His emotions were still mixed at the way she had broken into the fight. But perhaps it was for the best. At any rate, he was still alive, and otherwise he might not have been. He said, "Soon as they get a breather, some of them will be back while another rides for help. This is the showdown. I've got to get out of here and get some help of my own. Maybe see a U.S. Marshal and tell him who I am while I still have a chance to speak my own piece. Where is the nearest one? I don't know. There's never been one around here." He fastened the throat latch of the bridle as she dumped a box of pistol cartridges into his right-hand coat pocket and a box of 30-30s for his rifle into the other. She had already fastened a flour sack of grub and a tight roll of blankets encased in his slicker behind the saddle while he was dressing over there in the back room with his ears full of the moaning of one of the men he had shot. While the merchant and Holden ministered to the fellow, Rip had flung a yellow-backed bill on the counter to pay for his purchases and for the work of smooching a plate-glass window from one of the abandoned buildings in the town and moving it up here to replace the one he had shattered. "Now," he said to Sarah, "wish me luck, will you? I think I'll need a whole wagon load of it." She said, "I do wish you luck." He stood hesitantly. "Well, I'll be seeing you." He swung up on the horse and rode from the barn, head low, and out of town, watchful for his enemies. But after half a mile, as the road fell into broken country, he pulled off it and began circling. He had some fairly good bearings on the place where he had found those bones. There was this about it. Whoever had written him the note to come there didn't intend to ambush him, he thought. If they had, they would simply have lain in wait at his bedroll or on the road to it and got him there. Or was that merely the line of reasoning they wished him to follow? He left his horse a good mile from the bones, the best he could judge, when the dirt gave out and bare stone began ringing underfoot. Rifle ready, he moved on, keeping to low ground and what cover he could find. He had a good plan. He was now upwind of the place. When nearly there, he would light a cigarette and leave it burning, and then circle. And while whoever was waiting for him peered upwind for the approaching smoker, he would get a chance to see who it was. Presently he halted and took off a glove to roll the cigarette. And just as he licked it, he heard a rattle of shots ahead. And after a moment the ring of hoofs, fading into silence, and then rising and fading again. He broke into a run now, and finally, his head throbbing, breath like a knife in his side, he came to a halt, deciding he had contrived to lose himself. Panting, heart pounding like thunder in his ears, he halted. He unbuttoned his coat, but now he drew it around him, holding his breath now and then to listen as he moved on. And presently, he saw a streak on the bedrock that had been made by a slipping horseshoe. This was the right way, after all. He moved along, watchful of the rim above him. He halted, as at the bend he saw a bone. This was the place. Against the wall of the bluff he took another step, and froze as the soles of a man's boots came into sight. Cautiously he moved ahead, watchful of rolling gravel. Frozen blood glittered brightly on the stones and on the dead man's coat. Rip stepped swiftly toward him now, and saw that it was Fulton. And 10 feet farther on, sitting all slumped down with his back against a boulder, chin on his chest, one hand on Rip's bedroll, was Fulton's partner Bragg. The other hand had frozen blood all over it as he held it to his stomach. Bragg opened his eyes. He looked at Rip vacantly, and then, with an obvious summoning of will, he said, "Rip." "Yeah." "The real Rip." Rip dropped to one knee by him. "Who shot you?" he asked. "Don't know. Fellow who has your ranch, I guess. We're U.S. deputy marshals. Berger was too. But he was kind of crazy lately. Thought we plotted against him. Stuff like that. It was him shot at you yesterday. Only he wasn't shooting at you. He was just trying to attract your attention. Wanted to talk. That bullet, which had struck a boulder a few yards from Rip yesterday, had attracted his attention all right. And it had come from a long distance away, judging from the length of time before he heard the crack of the gun. But it hadn't come from so far, he reckoned, that Berger couldn't have yelled at him, or at least have ridden up into yelling distance of his tired horse. And the second bullet was even closer. But this was no time to argue. Bragg whispered, "This fellow on your ranch, he and—" His breath faded away. His eyes closed. He opened them again and peered blankly at Rip. "Who are you?" He made as if to rise and slumped against the rock. His head fell back and his blue eyes stared at the cold sky. "My God!" Rip breathed. He walked unsteadily back to Fulton and saw that he had been shot in the back, left shoulder and arm. He shook his head, glancing about for any evidence the killer might have left. His sense of the terrible had been numbed by all that had happened this morning, but he got a fresh shock as he noticed the bleaching skull that lay with the scattered bones in the crevice of a rock. The upper jawbone was broken, and some of the teeth knocked away in front where Cash Emmett's gold tooth had been. He went to it and knelt, not touching it. The cheekbones were wide and high, as Cash's had been, and a glance at an arm bone showed it to be long and thick as Cash's arms had been. "My God!" Rip breathed again. And then, in a hollow of the rock, he saw 6 bullets where they had fallen from the flesh as it decomposed. He picked them up in a shaking hand. .45 feet Tess. Somebody was really looking for trouble or wanting to deal it out, packing a cannon like that, and with all 6 chambers loaded. Rip's cousin, Colonel Jock Depew of the Texas Rangers, had a theory that you could look at 2 bullets with a magnifying glass and tell if they had been shot by the same gun, and he had forced a confession out of a murderer that way. And if there really was anything to the theory, he turned back to Fulton. If he had one of the bullets out of him now, some vagrant sound or some sixth sense warned him that he was not alone. Rifle ready, he dropped among the rocks, shooting glances upward and along the narrow canyon. Sarah called, "Mr. Rip, it's me." And she came around the bend as he rose. Out of breath, she said, "I knew that rock was thrown through your window. Must have had a note tied to it. I thought you might need some help, but you went so fast I kept losing you." She halted as she saw the carnage. She looked from the 2 men to Rip, and then her eyes went over the bones. The toughest part of all would be telling her about Cash. Before Rip could speak, a rough high voice called out, "What's this shooting going on my range?" Whirling to look upward, Rip saw a wildly bearded old man on the bluff above, his eyes magnified into huge blurs by the thick spectacles he wore. He had a pistol in his hand. A .45. He said, "What you doing here with my daughter?" "What is this, Sarah?" Rip said, "A lot you must worry about your daughter, leaving her to shift for herself." Sarah said, "Mr. Rip, I appreciate your attitude, but I'll thank you not to speak to my father like that." The old man seemed to shrink into himself. Dispiritedly, he said, "You're right, mister, whoever you are. I was coming in to see you, baby. That poor ignorant drifter, Knowlesby, that cooks for that buzzard who made us lose our lease come by last night and said." His voice petered out, and after a moment he added, "Well, if 'twas to do over again, you fetching in that money, I'd do things different, even if you did get it gambling. Who's this man you're out here with?" Sarah was quiet now, there by the rock mound that would serve as a temporary tomb for Cash Emmett's remains and for the bodies of the other 2 men. There was no telegraph line in 100 miles to send word to the outside world about the 2 deputies, and consequently no point in taking their bodies to town. Old Zeke Innes went after the horses while Sarah and Rip stacked the rocks. Now she made a packet of the dead men's personal articles and credentials, while with the charging tools from his bedroll, Rip worked the slugs out of 6 of the .45 cartridges of the dead Fulton. He reloaded the brass with the slugs he had picked up from the rocks. The slugs that had killed Cash Emmett. He would take Fulton's gun and load it with these cartridges. He would find the man who had killed Cash, and with its quality these same bullets he would finish him. He said, "You thought a lot of Cash, or Cass as you knew him." "He was a good friend," Sarah said. Rip nodded. "A mighty good one. And if it hadn't been for me sending him up here ahead of me, he'd be alive now. Maybe. And maybe, if you hadn't sent him, he would have been dead even quicker. There's no looking ahead for things like that." There was some small comfort in that, but not much. Silently, Rip polished off the lead of a couple of the newly loaded cartridges so that they would slide freely into the chambers. 5 he put in. The spare he pocketed, along with a slug which he had probed from Fulton's arm. When he had time, he wanted to compare the two with a glass and see if they looked to have come from the same weapon. Zeke was coming back with the horses now, he guessed, for there came whinnies from the nearby draw where the mounts of the dead deputies were tethered. Sarah was relieved that she was going home with her father, yet, as she confessed to Rip, it would have been so much nicer if it could have happened while there was still time to keep the bar T from taking up their lease. "You're forgetting one thing," Rip told her. "I'm the bar T, I'll make that right. I'll see that your cattle are replaced." She shook her head. "No. There's no call for you to straighten up another man's crimes. That's our problem. A criminal is everybody's problem, just like a range fire is everybody's fire," Rip countered. He cleared his throat. "You reckon this Martha Haley, what sort of an attitude do you suppose she'd take if I told her plain out about this fellow? The hotel keeper said he was courting her, that she was his girl. She doesn't seem like the kind of girl who'd be interested in him if she knew what he really is. Well, on the other hand, if you like someone, it might be hard for you just to take someone's word that that person isn't what he should be." "Yes," he agreed, "but she seems like such a nice girl. I think I'll go over there." Old Zeke came in sight just then, and presently he and Sarah were riding off home together, leading the spare horses and taking Rip's extra baggage. He was somewhat disconcerted at Sarah's quick interruption when her father suggested Rip have dinner with them. She had said, "Really, Papa, we must not impose on Mr. Rip's time. He has food with him, and somewhere else that he wants to go." It was mid-afternoon when he came into sight of what he reckoned must be the main buildings of the Hide and Horns outfit. At least, the great corrals he had been passing for an hour had wool caught on the fences, and the range was pockmarked with sheep tracks. There was lots of cedar for windbreaks. Not a horse was in sight anywhere, though of course there might be some he couldn't see around the barns. A little smoke came out of a flue. He rode on up, heart beating fast, and helloed. No answer. He went into the yard and onto the porch and knocked. Still no answer. At the back door, he was able to rouse no one. It was warm here in the sun, and he sat down on the back steps to consider. Was that dust moving to the northwest? He took his telescope from his pocket and focused it on the cedars over there a mile or so away. Dust plume moving along all right. He followed it with the glass. Something doing there. The sheep he picked up in his field of vision had stopped nipping frosted grass to look up and go running off. He could see their quick chewing stop, and then their mouths open as they blatted. He picked up the rider, then threw a break in the cedars. Martha Haley. She sat her black horse well, as she came swiftly this way. After a long time, Rip lost sight of her as the land dipped. He sat there, fingering the glass, and then he remembered something. From his pocket, he took the slug he had removed from Fulton's arm and the cartridge he had loaded with one of the slugs which had killed Cash Emmett. He loosened the stop on the eyepiece of his telescope and removed it, and focused the lens upon the 2 pieces of lead. Slowly he turned them in his hand and studied them. If his cousin's theory was correct, that bullets shot from the same gun would show it, these evidently had been. They were marked the way a bullet always got marked in shooting, and the marks seemed to be the same. The back gate slammed, and Martha said, "What have we here?" She smiled brightly at him. Rip rose, stammering foolishly, his breath short. "Lord, she was pretty," she said. "If you're as cold as I am, you'd like to get by a fire. How would some coffee be?" "Fine," he declared. And when they were in the bright, cheerful kitchen, and their coats and gloves and scarfs off and the cook stove roaring, she said, Do I remember correctly your introduction of yesterday? Rip said. Yes'm, I expect you do. I got quite a bit of a jolt after that when I found out there's another fellow here on my Aunt Doris's bar tea passing himself off as me. I hear he was sort of courting you, and I thought, well, of course, it's none of my business, but I thought you ought to know he's not what he claims to be. Really? She exclaimed with interest. You seriously expect me to believe that? I don't expect you to believe anything that I can't make you see is the truth. Would you care to hear the truth? Why, of course. But the charge is so monstrous. Briefly, he outlined to her the play as he saw it, and he showed her the bullets through his glass. When he had finished, she said, It's fantastic. He seems like such a nice, sincere man, too. The kettle was beginning to sing, and as she reached for the Arbuckle can, she said, The only thing to do is to get the authorities in here with a gang of deputies big enough to handle this thing, and not to show our hand again until we've enough men to really accomplish something. Rip said, Maybe. But if that fellow were out of the way, the rest of the layout would fall apart. Of course, she said, but who's going to bell the cat? You've warned him now that you know his game. He'll shoot you on sight. He'll double his watch for you, and stay under cover himself. Look, you better stable your horse in case anyone should pass within sight of here, and I'll set us on a bite to eat. His lunch, gobbled in the saddle, could stand another lunch on top of it, and without much protest he agreed. As he came back from the barn, he took off his coat again and hung the heavy gun belts on a chair. One thing that had me worried, he said. I was afraid you might have seen this fellow last night and mentioned that I told you I was Rip, your new neighbor. Lucky I didn't see him, she declared, slicing a loaf of white bread. Or I guess I would have, though of course I thought you were joking. Raise the cellar door for me, will you? And I'll get us some wild plum preserves to go on this bread. My pulley rope broke, and seems like I can't think to get another one. He went to the corner of the kitchen, where the heavy oaken door was located. Used to be our storm and fruit cellar both, till we built the kitchen on and took it in, she said. It was made to turn a cyclone. Rip caught the lock hasp and grunted as he swung it up. Kind of spooky down there, Martha said. Rip smiled indulgently. Whereabout are the plums? At the back, top shelf. He went down, and as he reached for a jar, the great door banged down, and he heard the hasp go in place as he whirled and lunged toward the steps. He banged and heaved without effect, and a moment later he felt the house jar, apparently with the slamming of the outside door. No faintest ray of light reached him, as he berated himself for getting into this mess. Sarah had been right. With Martha liking this other fellow, anyone with any sense wouldn't have expected her to swallow a story like the one Rip had told her. And now she would bring the man here. He explored the place with his hands. There was nothing but shelves of jars and a bin of potatoes. Rip found the shelf with the fewest jars on it and started setting them off. When that was done, he heaved and twisted to get the planks loose. Something gave abruptly, and he went backward, tearing out the whole tier of shelves, and they tumbled down upon him, along with jars of fruit, as he crashed into the shelves on the other side. Jars on the shelves behind him were smashed, and glass and fruit poured down upon him. Chapter 5. He waited in the wreckage, bruised and sticky. He twisted and heaved at the loosened bank of shelves until he broke them apart and obtained a battering ram. 10 minutes' work with it, beating blindly at the door in the darkness, brought him only bruised hands. Panting, he smeared a sleeve across his sweaty face and got an application of pear preserves from it for his trouble. He explored the door then with his hands, hunkering there on the steps. The hasp was held on by a bolt, with a nut on this side. It was caked with rust and immovable. With a sticky hand, he got out his knife and opened the heavy square-pointed blade for drilling holes in harness straps. By the bolt, he started drilling through the oak wood, the blade screeching and grating, his knuckles now and then rubbing the stone wall. The time was interminable before the knife struck the hasp on the other side, and he started drilling a second hole. This time, it came out at the edge of the hasp so that a blink of light showed. He scooted down into the cellar again, and found his battering ram and started beating at the ray of light. Finally, he gave that up and bowed his back against the slanting door and pushed. The hasp snapped free with a splintering of wood. He shoved open the door, and panting and blowing, he wobbled up into the kitchen. No one was in sight, out the back way in the twilight. He took a couple of minutes to wash and dry the stickiness from his hands and face, and to scrape a few stray peach fragments from his hat. He found the lard bucket, and rubbed a bit of grease between his palms and then on his face to protect him from the freezing wind. Bucking on the guns, he got into his scarf and coats and gloves. His alarm had settled now to a burning anger so deep that it made him ill. An anger at himself and at Martha Haley, and at this man who called himself Campbell. The part that graveled him worst of all was that he had made a fool of himself, spouting off to this girl, letting his emotions get tangled up with his brains, when a little common sense should have told him to play his cards close to his belly and to blow smoke in the eyes of anyone looking over his shoulder. In the barn, his horse, still saddled, was eating hay. He warmed the bits, putting them inside his coat and blowing his breath upon them, and bridled the animal. He had made a decision. The last place on earth this Campbell would expect to see him was at the bar T, so that was the place to go. And when he found the man, he would draw his gun and shoot him as he would a mad dog. Just draw and fire and be done with it. No heroics. No offering him an even break. In war, you didn't send the enemy notice that you were going to attack at daylight and to be ready. This was war. The fellow had started the battle, picked the field. Now let him protect himself as best he might. Evidently, he guessed, Martha had had trouble locating the man, or she would have been back with him by now, as it was only 8 or 9 miles to the bar T buildings, as he understood it. It would be foolish trying to cross the range after dark in strange country. Best to take the road. Find Shorty Graves and let him know about Cash's death, and settle down to wait the boss's return. No use running everywhere looking for a will-o'-the-wisp. The rat trap didn't chase the rat. It sat and waited, and let the rat do all the exerting. The road from the ranch house out to the main road was half a mile long and fairly well shielded by cedar. At the main road, he turned to his right. It was all but dark now, and cold with the stars low and bright. Not bright enough for shooting, but he held his pistol in his gloved hand just the same. After a couple of miles or so, as the horse dropped to a walk to pick its way through the rubble where a creek bed crossed the road, he thought he heard a noise ahead. He halted the animal, pulling his scarf away from his ear as he cocked his head. It was the unmistakable plop-plop of the hoofs of walking horses, mingled with the clatter and bump of a wagon. But whether it was coming or going, he couldn't tell. "Boss," a guarded voice called downwind of the road. "That you?" And as he turned, a lantern was thrown open, and a bull's eye of light darted around to pick him up. He fired 3 times, cringing against the expected impact of lead as his horse leapt forward. One of the bullets struck the lantern, shattering the globe. The kerosene flared high, and in the smoking blaze as it was dropped, he saw a man wobbling on his feet. The man steadied himself against a tree and tried to raise a 6-gun. Rip fired again, and the man's 6 exploded into the ground. Saw the man's head jerk and the bark fly as the lead passed through and grazed the tree. Well, he had roused the whole countryside now, besides lighting a beacon to show just where the trouble was. He leapt down and ran back to where the man was threshing in the pool of fire and kicked sand and gravel over it. And when only the stinking fumes were left, and the dead man's smoldering clothes extinguished, he caught his horse and led him into the brush, downwind from the road. That wagon driver might come back. As he stood listening, he discerned that the wagon had halted. It was minutes later when his horse pricked up its ears. Rip had heard nor seen nothing, but a voice called softly, "Columbus? Columbus!" It was not on the road, but out here in the brush. Rip drifted silently away from his horse with the rifle from the boot in his hands. "Yeah," he answered softly. "Get him." "Winged him hard," Rip whispered. "He's out in here somewhere." "Well, let's get the hell out. This is spooky. Bad enough to go hauling coffins around this time of night." Rip saw the approaching man, now. He walked toward him, keeping to the blackest shadows as cedar limbs whipped his face. Just as he stepped out into the patch of starlight, the man said, "Columbus," in a startled sort of way. Rip swung the gun barrel, but the fellow jumped back, fending with a rifle of his own. Rip swung again as the man charged in, diving toward Rip's face with the end of the rifle barrel. The ground under him was hard and cold, and a rock jammed itself into his head as he lay on his side. Jammed and jammed and jammed again, and a steady clacking beat was in his ears. The beat of... He shook his head. He seemed to be moving. He was moving. The beat was the thumping back and forth of wagon wheels on their thimbles. But the stars had gone out. It was almighty black. He twisted, raising his tied hands, and they struck something solid. Even in that moment, he sensed where he was. In one of the coffins in the wagon the man had mentioned. With the body of one of the men he had shot in town this morning. Or Berger, who was shot last night. He fought down the panic and revulsion that rose within him. Now he could make out the pressure of the stiffened corpse against his back. He raised his hands to press against the lid of the casket, but it was immovable. The man would take him to the bar, like the rat in the trap that he had been thinking about. The wagon halted. He heard the plop of other hoofs, and the halting of them. A man said, "All right, boys. Tend your horses, all but Ferd and Biscuit and Fatty." It was the boss. Above the thunder of his heart, Rip heard someone say, "What about the rest of us, boss? Hell, we're cold and hungry." "You've got the rest of your lives to warm and feed yourselves," the boss said, with the easy assurance of one who knows himself to be in full control. "We'll get the burying over tonight. But we just got one grave, boss, and 3 coffins." "You didn't let me finish. I was going to say we'd get part of it over tonight. Berger and this outlaw tug roll in the top coffin there." Rip started convulsively, banging his head. Somebody said, "Listen. He's alive." "Won't be long," the boss said. "Ain't a lot of air in there." "But you ain't." "Who says I ain't?" "But why?" "Because it suits me too. It'll make me feel good." Another exclaimed, "But I caught him. He's worth $2,500 in California." The boss laughed easily. "Now cool off, fellow," he suggested. "I put those signs up in order to get the varmint killed before he got up here, because he's a slick one." Convincingly, he added, "He gave me lots of trouble in Texas, using my name and trying to beat me out of my property there, and so on. And as for burying him alive, why, he buried 3 of my punchers alive one time. Roped them, and threw them in a mine shaft and started a landslide. He's a devil. Burying alive is too good for him." And after a pause, "I'm glad Berger is out of the way too. Somehow, I didn't trust that guy. And those 2 other fellows, I got them dead to rights this morning in the canyon where I biased that Cass Calhoun that was messing around with Sarah Innes. Mining men. Huh. I figure Berger was another federal if we knew the truth. Well, drive on. Let's get this over with." I want those fellows underground, and a brush pile burnt on the place before anyone comes snooping. Somebody said, Hell, boss, I can't sleep if we bury him still kicking. Let me put a slug or two through there. The boss's voice changed. Sure, if you want me to put one or two through you. Get going. There on his side, Rip strained and twisted and kicked and buckled himself against the boards, but to no avail. There was but little room with the body of Burger jammed in here on its side too. He was horribly ill, and he was scared, and he made no bones of it to himself as he fought down panic. He had been in danger of his life before. He had ridden with danger as his saddle partner. But always he had been in the open where he had a chance. The boss called mockingly, How does that wooden overcoat fit, mister? Rip steeled himself to silence, to sudden immobility. He would not give the man the pleasure of hearing him struggle. And if he remained silent, the precious supply of air would last longer. Give him time to think. If he could do nothing to persuade this devil to release him, at least the man might think he had smothered, and lose the satisfaction of believing he was in torment. He lay there, gasping and sweating, with the unwashed smell of Burger's body in his nostrils. A momentary stab of hope came to him. Maybe Shorty, up at the cookhouse, would find out what was happening. But one against this bunch. As he became still, he began to be aware of something. His left elbow, as he moved it slightly, rubbed over the cartridges in the dead man's belt. He turned a little. Something that felt like a pistol at his own side. His left side. The .45 he had loaded with the slugs that killed Cash Emmett. Cords cutting into his flesh, numbing his hands, he strained and jerked trying to get hold of the weapon. A wheel hit a big rock, bouncing the coffin heavily, and then the wagon stopped. The boss said, All right, boys. Drag them out, he ate. Who's that? Somebody riding out from the house. Take it easy, boys. Have your guns ready, and keep your mouths shut. Rip presently heard the hoofbeats, and then the boss exclaimed, Why, it's Miss Haley. Howdy there, Martha. What you out about this time of night? I've been riding the legs off this critter to find you, she told him. I've been at your house for an hour or more. Some of your men who came in just now said I'd find you here. Could I see you privately? Fade, boys, the boss said. Plumb over to the fence there. As Rip kept trying to get the pistol, he could hear only a word now and then. Claims he's you. Got him locked in my cellar. Ah. Well, ain't you the smart one? Rip suddenly lay deathly still, for fear the boss might do something to the girl if she discovered what had taken place, and that he was now here alive in a coffin. She said, And now, I guess that proves how I feel about you. I guess that shows. The boss said, Look, Martha. I told you I had my eye on somebody else. She wouldn't have you, the way you've acted buying up their lease. Oh, I don't know. By the time it's over, I wouldn't be surprised if she thinks I'm a pretty good fellow. Oh, wouldn't you? Well, listen, the boss warned flatly. You try anything and I'll run you so far out of this country it'll take a year to send you a letter. You won't have a shred of character left. You wouldn't dare tell. Wouldn't I? Just remember to build your fence next time, before you plant your crop. And by a fence, I mean get a wedding ring. You couldn't make nobody believe that. You? There came the crackling sound of a slap, and the boss swore and exclaimed, Well, you asked for this, baby. A muffled cry was cut short in the middle. Something approaching horror had welled in Rip as they talked. A feeling as if he had seen a pretty object and picked it up only to discover it was a snake. But now, as she screamed, he made one last lunge in the coffin in a futile, instinctive effort to go to her assistance. Then the boss spoke in a subdued voice. Come on, boys. Time's wasting. Silence, except for the rattling of a chain as the end gate was removed. A man spoke then. Count me out, boss. I didn't hire on to help fight women or bury them. She ain't dead. I just popped her under the jaw. I'll handle her. I'll make her damned glad to keep her trap shut. I'll make her leave the country. Get that coffin out and quit talking so much. Rip saw that quietness would avail him nothing now. He wouldn't beg. He would die like an Indian, as far as speech went, but he could still try for his gun even if it made a noise. The boss growled. Kick away, cowboy. It ain't for long. The coffin bumped and thumped as they dragged it from the wagon. Set it on the lowering ropes, the boss ordered. Here now. All together. I'm cold. I want to get in. The coffin scraped and grated as it swung through space, and then it bumped heavily against the bottom of the grave, and the ropes were jerked free. Frozen clods rattled on the coffin lid above Rip. He choked back the cry of protest that welled to his lips, and gave a mighty surge that twisted him half over between Berger's body and the coffin lid. And then he discovered the .45 was wrenched within reach. He turned the end of the holster up against the lid of the coffin and got a thumb over the trigger and pulled it. Once, twice, 3 times. Choking on the smoke, ears and head bursting on the gun thunder, he shoved himself up against the lid, and then something hit the bulging upper side like a horse. The lid cracked with a sharp snap. Apparently, men had jumped down upon it with fresh, jarring force. Faintly, Rip heard their quick, hard voices. A man was sawing. Shot, I'm shot, I'm shot. The weight lifted. Rip twisted his shoulder against the lid, and as the wrecked boards flew aside, he shot dizzily to his feet. The moon had risen now. All in a flash, he saw a couple of men helping another toward the wagon. The boss was saying, "Who are those riders?" And Shorty Graves' voice shouted, "Hold that, you varmints." A rifle spoke by way of emphasis, making an orange streak in the night. Lead zinged on a wagon tire and buzzed away. And then another gun spoke from near the first, making an orange streak in the night. And then another gun spoke. Rip ducked back into the grave from the fusillade. Evidently, the boss didn't know he had broken free at last. Rip called to him. "Hey, you, turn around." The man had started to duck behind the wagon, as his men deserted the wounded one. With a startled oath, the boss whirled toward the grave, the pistol he had drawn still unfired. He said, "Where?" And then, as he whipped up the pistol, Rip fired the gun that was held in his bound hands. Once, twice, again on the empty chamber. "Where did Miss Sarah go?" Shorty Graves demanded. Rip thought he saw her moving toward her horse. He was sure of it. He ran toward her. "Sarah, I mean, Miss Innes." She kept on going toward the horses. He came up to her there. "Sarah." Back by the wagon, a little later, Shorty Graves said, "Ain't he kissing her?" "Can't see," old Zeke growled, "but I wouldn't be surprised. Wouldn't nothing much surprise me these days." "Or else her kissing him," Shorty said. He sighed. "Well, it's high time somebody roped that maverick in." He spat. "Which one?" Shorty watched the couple, nothing more than dark shadows in the moonlight. The end.